Mr. President, Ambassadors, Secretary General, NDB President Rousseff, distinguished diplomats, ladies and gentlemen. Today's meeting takes place at a time of several major wars. In my testimony, I will refer to four: the Ukraine War, which started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych; the Israel-Palestine War, which has flared repeatedly since 1967; the Syrian War, which began in 2011; and the Sahel Wars, which began in 2012 in Mali and have now spread throughout the Sahel. These wars may seem intractable, but they are not. Indeed, I would suggest that all four wars could be ended quickly by agreement within the UN Security Council. One reason is that major wars must be fed from the outside, both with external finances and armaments. The UN Security Council could agree to choke off these awful wars by withholding external finance and armaments. This would require an agreement among the major powers. The other reason why these wars can end quickly is that they result from economic and political factors that can be addressed through diplomacy rather than through war. By addressing the underlying political and economic factors, the Security Council can establish conditions for peace and sustainable development. Let me consider each of the four wars in turn briefly. The war in Ukraine has two main political causes. The first is the attempt by NATO to expand to Ukraine despite the timely and repeated objections by Russia. Russia considers NATO presence in Ukraine as a significant threat to Russia's security. The second political cause is the East-West ethnic division in Ukraine, partly along linguistic and partly along religious lines. Following the overthrow of President Yanukovych in 2014, ethnic Russian regions broke away from the post-coup government and appealed for protection and autonomy. The Minsk II agreement, endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2202, called for regional autonomy to be incorporated in Ukraine's constitution, but the agreement was never implemented by Ukraine, despite the UN Security Council backing. This Council could end the Ukraine war quickly by addressing its underlying political and economic causes. On the political front, the P5 countries should agree to extend a security guarantee to Ukraine while also agreeing that NATO will not expand to Ukraine, thereby addressing Russia's concerns over NATO enlargement. The Council should also work to achieve a lasting governance solution regarding Ukraine's ethnic divisions. Consider in a similar way the war in Israel and Palestine. Here, too, the war could be ended quickly by the Council enforcing the many UN Security Council resolutions made over several decades calling for a return to the 1967 borders, an end of Israel's settlement activities in the occupied territories, and the two-state solution, including in UN Security Council's resolutions 242, 338, 1397, 1515, and 2334. It is clear that Israel and Palestine are unable to reach agreements in line with these UN Security Council resolutions. On both sides, hardliners repeatedly frustrate moderates who seek peace based on the two-state solution. It is high time, therefore, in my view, for the UN Security Council to enforce its decisions by implementing a just and lasting solution that is in the interests of both Israel and Palestine, rather than allowing hardliners on both sides to ignore the mandate of this Council and thereby to threaten global peace. My recommendation to this Council is that it immediately recognize the state of Palestine in a matter of days or weeks and welcome Palestine as a full member of the United Nations, with the capital in East Jerusalem and with sovereign control over the Islamic holy sites. The Council should establish a peacekeeping force drawn heavily from the neighboring Arab countries to help provide security in Palestine. Such an outcome is in the overwhelming will of the international community and the manifest interest of both Israel and Palestine, despite the vociferous objections by hardline rejectionists on both sides of the divide. The Council could similarly end the war in Syria. The Syrian war broke out in 2011 when several regional powers and the United States joined forces to topple the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This deeply misguided regime change operation failed. but it triggered a prolonged war with enormous bloodshed and destruction, including of ancient cultural heritage sites. The Council should make clear that all P5 countries and the countries in Syria's neighborhood are in full agreement that all regime change attempts are now permanently ended, and that the UN Security Council intends to work closely with the Syrian government on reconstruction and development. The war in the Sahel has similar roots. Just as the regional powers in the U.S. aimed to overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad in 2011, the NATO powers similarly aimed to overthrow the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. In pursuing this aim, they grossly exceeded the mandate of UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which had authorized the protection of Libya's civilian population, but certainly not authorized a NATO-led regime change. The violent overthrow of the Libyan government quickly spilled over to the impoverished countries of the Sahel. Poverty alone made these Sahelian countries highly vulnerable to the influx of armaments and militias. The result has been ongoing violence and multiple coups, gravely undermining the possibility of economic improvement. Directly across the street from us is Isaiah's wall, with the visionary words of the great Jewish prophet of the 8th century BCE. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. It is time to honor Isaiah's words by ending these useless and destructive wars, slashing military outlays and turning the savings into new investments in education, healthcare, renewable energy, and social protection. As an American, I am proud that our greatest president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the visionary who oversaw the establishment of this great institution. I firmly believe in the capacity of the United Nations and of this Security Council to keep the peace and to promote sustainable development. When all 193 UN member states, or 194 with the membership of Palestine, live up to the UN Charter, we will have a new global age of peace and sustainable development. Thank you.
Okay, we are live with Alexander Mercouris and the one and only Professor Jeffrey Sachs. So, Alexander, let's get to it. We have a lot to discuss today.
Professor Sachs, you did an exceptional presentation to the UN Security Council. You discussed the fact that we are in a world at war in many places. You itemized 4 wars. You gave a thread that unites all of these wars. That thread, it seemed to me, was Western, ultimately American policy, and a propensity to seek military solutions and forcible solutions rather than diplomatic ones. Is that a fair view?
Well, it was a happy occasion for me to be able to meet directly with the 15 members of the UN Security Council and lay out a proposition, which was a pretty basic one, which is that if the Security Council uses the powers that it has under the UN Charter, Article 7, and the powers to enforce UN Security Council resolutions, even the ones that have been adopted to date, it can end the raging wars around the world. And yes, at the core of all of these has been U.S. meddling in contradiction, in direct violation of the UN Charter. At the core of the UN Charter is the doctrine of non-intervention. Leave others alone, a kind of golden rule between nations. And it's at the core of the UN Charter, and it's at the core of several resolutions of the General Assembly. It's the overwhelming weight of global opinion. Don't meddle in our internal affairs. Don't threaten other countries. Live alongside other countries. Of course, in Ukraine, the basic truth is that this is a push by NATO for enlargement. And we had this remarkable interview by the Ukrainian senior politician laying it all out. It wasn't news, except that it came from a senior Ukrainian politician. The Israel-Gaza conflict could be stopped today, immediately, if the UN Security Council would enforce its many resolutions, probably in the dozens by now, calling for a two-state solution on 1967 borders. That is a state of Palestine with its capital in East Jerusalem and its control over the Islamic holy sites. The third war that I discussed is the ongoing war in Syria. Now, that has a simple origin, an incredible one, but a simple one. And that is that probably it was Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. Maybe it was the bright idea of Barack Obama as president, but it got into the heads of some American leaders. Hey, why don't we overthrow the government of Syria? And in late 2011, they decided, Assad must go. And President Obama signed a presidential finding ordering the CIA to work with regional governments to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Completely illegal. Did anyone refer the U.S. leaders to the International Criminal Court? No. This is how this system misfires. And the arrogance of all of this, of course, is shocking because that was a dozen years ago. All it did was lead to mass bloodshed, destruction of places like Palmyra that had survived for 2,000 years, and then we have to destroy it because the CIA's given an order to overthrow a government. And the fourth war that I discussed was the war that has been raging in the Sahel since 2012. That's a war that started in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad. It spread throughout this impoverished region. Why? Well, because in 2011, again, against the UN Charter, against the decisions of the UN Security Council, the United States, UK, and France took it into their heads to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And under the ruse of protecting civilian populations with, false, exaggerated threats about the civilian populations, NATO bombed Libya throughout 2011 until Gaddafi was killed. Chaos ensued in Libya, and armaments and militias and others spilled over into the impoverished region of the Sahel. But in general, the United States has pushed regime change. Now, the reason people will say it's naive is, well, that's the U.S. They have a veto. They can do whatever they want. But as you have been saying, and I have been repeating, the world is changing. This unipolarity claimed by the United States has been exposed for the fraud that it is. The U.S. is neither unipolar, nor is the rule-based system anything to do with rules. It's quite the contrary. And as the world comes to know this as common knowledge, we have the capacity actually to stop the abuses. Of course, the U.S. does it secretly, quote unquote. And because of the complicity of the mainstream media, a lot of people don't know the facts. And when you tell them the facts, such as NATO caused the war in Ukraine, oh, no, that's not true. But the facts do come out. David Arakhamia, the lead of Zelensky's party in the Ukrainian parliament, said it was all NATO, all the rest, and I'll quote him, was blah, blah, blah. And by the way, if you didn't want to wait for David Arakhamia to say it, we heard it from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, in his little gaffe, meaning he told the truth by accident, when he spoke to the European Parliament recently. Is the U.S. benefiting from Ukraine, from the $100 billion plus that it has put in from the disasters on the battlefield? Is that really helping the U.S.? No. The American people have said, stop this. Is the ongoing war in the Middle East really helping the United States? No. And the American people have turned on that, which is rather amazing given the amount of sentiment on this over the years. There's a complete change of view, which has stopped this war. Did the Americans benefit from this completely absurd war in Syria, which was somebody's idea out of thin air? Why don't we overthrow that government? Did that really help the United States? Is the United States really helped by having instability across Western and Central Africa? Of course not. So even the American people, who don't exactly hear much of the truth from the mainstream media, have figured out this foreign policy doesn't work. And when Biden looks at his, I think, rapidly falling prospects of reelection, one of the things that's stark about American public opinion is they're actually looking at foreign policy. And they're saying, we don't approve of what you're doing. And what's important to understand is how addicted the U.S. is to these regime changes. One excellent book, which I like to refer to, is a book by an associate professor at Boston College, Lindsay O'Rourke, who just counted and studied carefully the secret regime change operations. The book is called Covert Regime Change during the Cold War period by the United States. 64 attempts to overthrow foreign governments secretly, illegally. It's an addiction. And this is what destabilizes the world, and it's completely against the UN Charter. But the point about the economics is twofold, actually. One is that, of course, lurking among the incentives, the military-industrial complex, the NATO enlargement, selling more weapon systems, the lobbying effort, which no doubt is a piece of this. Also, typically games being played very often about who's going to control Libya's hydrocarbons, or who's going to control the offshore Mediterranean gas deposits, because actually Palestine has a claim to these gas deposits, which are in Palestinian waters if there were a state of Palestine. And the United States and Israel are just claiming this stuff. And so, and the Syrian disaster, at least arguably, had to do with where pipelines would go from the Caspian and the Black Sea through to the Mediterranean. So there are all sorts of games. Now, whether they are the central motivators or not, it depends on the circumstances. It depends on the point of view. But there's usually some motive, and amazingly often it's oil and gas, because that is like the Midas curse of our time, even until today. Economic development is be nice to your neighbors, because you trade with them. You have land routes with them. You have pipelines with them. You share renewable energy resources. You share river sheds. You share biomes. If, as an economist, I would say the first rule of development is be nice to your neighbors. As an empire, the first rule is divide et impera, divide and conquer. And so the idea of the United States always is your next door neighbor's your enemy. It's Orwell. So if we get past imperial mentality and get to economic development mentality, your neighbor is your trading partner. Your neighbor shares river sheds. Your neighbor shares biomes. Your neighbor shares a power grid with you. Cooperate. So the point I was making was we need regional programs of cooperation. But the U.S. divide and conquer strategy has been the direct foe of this. And the whole U.S. strategy and geopolitics around the world is your neighbor's your enemy. We protect you. You allow us to put a military base there. We protect you against your worst enemy, which is your neighbor. And as long as that thinking goes on, it destroys economic logic. We're spending more than $2 trillion a year right now to destroy things. And yes, it's a business for a few companies in the United States, Boeing and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed and General Dynamics and so on. But for the rest of us, it is an absolute drain and destruction on economic well-being.